Ukraine and Russia have both thrown their tanks back into battle as the front lines appear to be crumbling, and Russia rejects what we understand are Donald Trump's proposals to freeze the front line. We're in Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey, I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with very dramatic footage of tanks in battle, both Ukrainian Leopard 2 tanks and a British Challenger 2 tank. The 33rd Brigade of Ukraine's armed forces fighting, we understand, near Kharkiv, although the location has not been confirmed, have released footage of their tanks and artillery destroying a Russian armoured column. Very dramatic footage showing these Russian troops trying to advance. Ukrainians saying 2 Russian tanks, 1 armoured personnel carrier, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, and around 50 Russian soldiers were killed in that engagement. They haven't said exactly when it happened, but analysts have noted that the original file that was uploaded was dated the 12th of November, and there's speculation that that was around Kharkiv, the southeastern part of the front line, where Russian forces have been making large gains. And indeed, the deep state open source analysts have reported Russian advances around the village of Dalny, which is just to the south of Kharkiv. Kharkiv itself to the south of Pokrovsk, which is where, as you know, Russian forces have been making gains, substantial and steady gains against Ukrainian forces. But this footage showing that on one occasion at least, the Ukrainian forces have inflicted very heavy losses, both in terms of men and crucially in terms of materiel. Russia has released similar footage, though, of what appears to be a British Challenger 2 tank taking a direct hit from a kamikaze one-way attack drone. And we understand that was, or at least that is reportedly in occupied Kursk region, where we know Ukraine's 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which operate the Challengers, we know those troops have been operating in Kursk. And indeed, we do also know that at least 1, possibly 2 of the British Challenger 2 tanks have been destroyed in Kursk already. Definitely 1. As I said, there were unconfirmed reports that a second was struck. Now, the outcome of this most recent attack on the Challenger 2, we don't know. We haven't seen aftermath footage. We do also know, of course, that in the first summer counteroffensive, Ukraine's first counteroffensive in the summer of 2023, there was a Challenger 2 tank that suffered what was known as an M-kill, a mobility kill. It had thrown a track near Orekhiv in Zaporizhia province. It was immobilized, the crew had left the vehicle, and it was subsequently hit by a Lancet drone, which ignited the fuel tank at the back, and dramatic footage of that tank at the time on fire. The other place where we've seen significant movement in the front line is Kupyansk, the eastern edge of Kharkiv Oblast, Kharkiv province. This is an area that was captured at the beginning of the war, that was on the front line since the beginning of the war. Ukraine rolled Russian forces back during its Kharkiv counteroffensive in that first autumn of the conflict. And since then, Kupyansk has always been a place where the front lines have been moving back and forth. Deep State, that open source analysis website, reported that it thought Russian forces had entered Kupyansk town. Now, Ukraine's armed forces categorically denying that today, but nonetheless an indication that there has been fierce fighting and indeed significant movement on that front line. After many, many months where the front lines have been pretty static and there's been sort of slow, grinding advances costing lots of lives and lots of material, lots of armour, things appear to be speeding up. And that may be linked to what I said in the opening, which is that Russia is rejecting out of hand suggestions that Donald Trump might attempt to freeze the front line. We heard from Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, suggesting that freezing the front lines would be even worse, in his words, than the Minsk agreements. And the Minsk agreements were widely seen as sort of favourable to Russia. Those were the agreements which had effectively held Russia and Ukraine in that very, very uneasy peace, or at least stalemate, or stasis is perhaps a better word, post-2014, and that's what was effectively in force right up until the moment that Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion on the 24th of February 2022. So Lavrov suggesting that freezing the front lines would be worse than that, and of course those Minsk agreements failed to stop a full-scale war. And just a reminder, this is based on reports that when Donald Trump takes over the presidency in the United States, he will try and honour his promise to end the war in a day, and his proposal was for a large sort of 20-mile demilitarized zone either side of the existing front lines. Sources in his camp have said he would continue to arm and resource Ukraine to try and provide a deterrent to further Russian aggression, but he wouldn't send any American troops to enforce that peace. A couple of other points to make today. Ukraine has claimed that it has assassinated with a car bomb attack the commander of the headquarters of a Russian missile boat unit in Sebastopol in Crimea. Valery Trankovsky reportedly killed when his car exploded. That's not the first time we've seen those attempts at targeted assassinations, but perhaps the most significant for some time. Dramatic footage emerging of that, the wreckage of that car smouldering after that attack, and Ukraine quite quick to claim responsibility, saying that Trankovsky was responsible for ordering attacks from Russian missile boats against civilian targets in Ukraine. They called him a war criminal. And finally, the head of Britain's Air Force, the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Richard Knighton, has used a speech to the Rusi think tank in London to say that Ukraine needs the capabilities to hit Russian airfields to destroy the aircraft that are launching glide bombs while they are still on the ground. And he said Britain would need exactly the same capability were it in a similar sort of conflict. He was saying there's no way that Ukraine can put up a shield, a screen against this volume of these glide bombs. The glide bombs are the relatively cheap, modified, dumb munitions that have been modified so they can be guided onto targets. And he said some 30,000 have been lobbed at Ukrainian forces in Kursk Oblast, where they've captured that pocket of sovereign Russian territory. He says they can't defend against that. The only way to defend against that is to go onto the attack and to hit those Russian bases, to destroy those aircraft where they are being, where the planes are taking off from to launch those bombs. Now, there's one interpretation of those comments is that he is saying Ukraine needs permission to use the Storm Shadow missiles that Britain has given Kyiv against targets in Russia. Britain wants to give Ukraine permission to do that. America has blocked it. It would certainly appear that Air Chief Marshal Knighton is saying that Ukraine should be able to use those missiles for that purpose. Equally, though, he just talked about capabilities, and there are many ways of destroying aircraft on the ground, as we have seen. Ukraine has already used drones. It has already used special forces sabotage missions, reminiscent of the sort of things that the SAS were founded on when they launched attacks against Axis airfields in Libya during World War II. And I think what Sir Richard Knighton was talking about is that full range of capabilities, but that's certainly a high-level endorsement from the UK against those strikes against targets in Russia. Now, if you have any questions and you're watching on YouTube, please do ask them in the comments below. And as always, I'll try and answer as many as I can next week. And if I can't answer them on the show, I'll get into the comments, as you know, and I'll answer them there as well. Question number one is, can Ukraine take Crimea? The short answer, I would say, is no, not by force, not by launching a full frontal assault, because we've seen that across the front lines, it's incredibly difficult for Ukraine to make any sort of significant gains, particularly in places where the front line is well defended. And the front lines in Kherson, closest to Crimea, is very well defended. But what I would also add is that Ukraine has, since I would say the start of this full-scale conflict, been taking very deliberate actions to put Crimea at threat. And how have they done that? Well, we've seen the attacks on the Kerch Bridge, the bridge that links occupied Crimea to mainland Russia. They've also, the objective of their summer counteroffensive in the summer of 2023, the summer and autumn of 2023, was actually try and push the front lines from Zaporizhia southward so that they could get their artillery within range of the land bridge that links sovereign Russia across the top of the Sea of Azov to Crimea, because those two routes, that land bridge and the Kerch bridge, are the main ways that Russia can supply its forces and indeed everybody who is living in Crimea. So they've tried to do that. They were unable to, with that summer counteroffensive, to get close enough. But we've also seen attacks on the ferries that operate across the Kerch Strait. And of course, we've seen numerous attacks against Russian military targets in Crimea. We've seen them against air defences, we've seen them against air batteries, perhaps most spectacularly against the naval headquarters, the Russian naval headquarters in Sebastopol, and against the ships, both against a submarine and a ship in dry dock, and of course numerous attacks from sea drones against ships, warships in and around the Crimean Peninsula. So that has put that whole territory at threat. And I think outwardly Ukraine says it is determined to expel all Russian forces from all of the territory that it considers sovereign, and that includes Crimea. Vladimir Putin, Moscow, there's an understanding in Kyiv, I think, that Moscow sees Crimea as different to the rest, much of the territory that it has captured during the course of this conflict. And that is perhaps why, by putting it at risk, because it's seen as more precious by Moscow, Ukraine is trying to gain that sort of leverage to influence the way this conflict may end. Question number 2 is about aid. We talked a lot about who was giving what last time. One of you making the point that suggesting it was unfair of me to lump all of Europe's aid together with America's aid. And then another one of you asking to perhaps look at how the aid from each country compares when you rank it by GDP. So these are getting at the same thing. Of course, America's economy is much bigger than the individual countries in Europe, and that's why we lump them together. And actually, when you look at it, when you look at the contributions to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP, the results are really interesting. And I'm going back to those Kiel Institute figures, so research by that German institute. In terms of GDP, the largest donors to Ukraine at about 2.2% are Denmark and Estonia. They're followed by Lithuania and Latvia, those small Baltic countries right on the front line. They're giving about 1.8% of their GDP to Ukraine, followed by Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden on about 1%. Then you've got Poland, Slovakia and the Netherlands all at about 0.7%. When it comes to the three biggest bilateral donors, that's the United States, Germany and the United Kingdom, they are way down the rankings. Germany is number 14. They're giving about 0.6% of their GDP. The UK ranks number 17 on 0.5% of its GDP. And America, whilst the single largest, by far the single largest bilateral donor to Ukraine, is actually ranked at number 24 in terms of percentage of GDP. America has given or pledged Ukraine 0.4% of its GDP. So a different way of looking at those numbers. American aid is absolutely key, but America and Americans are making relatively a smaller sacrifice for Ukraine than many of those countries in Europe. Next question. Is this conflict just a test ground for Russia and North Korea because they've got much bigger plans? Ominous question, suggesting that this is just the first step in a bigger conflict in World War III that Russia's going to roll across Europe. Without doubt, both armies will be gaining really valuable lessons from having their troops in conflict. It's one thing having an army and having all the armour and pieces that go with it, but if it's not tested in battle, then it will just be of a different calibre to those troops that have been battle tested and battle hardened. Russia might have hoped that this was going to be a test when they launched this in 2022 and the idea of a 3-day conflict and a walkover. But there's no doubt now its soldiers are really fighting to the sort of utmost of their ability as hard as they can, and they are suffering immense losses. But nonetheless, they'll also be learning lessons. And the same for North Korea. Their involvement on a much, much smaller scale, but still significant, some 10 to 12,000 troops, most of them now in Kursk. North Korea has not fought a proper conflict for about 70 years. It will clearly be learning valuable lessons, and that is something that its adversaries in the West should be aware of. And final question today, sticking with the role of North Korea, is will South Korea send troops to help Ukraine? South Korea has said that all options are on the table. It said that it's considering sending translators and intelligence officials to help Ukraine track what North Korea is up to interrogate prisoners of war. There is an ongoing debate within South Korea over whether it could sell or donate weapons directly to Ukraine and whether or not that would need a change in its constitution or in its laws. What it is doing is selling huge quantities of weapons to Ukraine's allies, and most notably Hyundai Rotem, which makes the Black Panther, the K2 Black Panther tank, has signed a deal with Poland for 1,000 tanks. Poland is buying 1,000 tanks off South Korea. And that's meant two things that we've seen recently. One is that has allowed Poland to become by far the largest bilateral donor of tanks to Ukraine. Poland has given Ukraine over 300 tanks, and most of those are old, legacy, Soviet-built and made tanks like the T-72, the T-80. Those are tanks that Ukraine already has. It knows how to operate, it knows how to maintain. So they were really valuable, and Poland was really quick at getting them in fast when Ukraine needed them. We've also seen Poland deploying some of these new South Korean K2 tanks close to the Russian border, and that's the border with the Kaliningrad exclave. And that appears to be, at this stage, just a show of force, a reminder perhaps that Poland has these new capabilities. That's all I'm going to do today. As ever, thank you very much for watching. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.